So I was lucky enough to speak with Angus Fletcher. He recently published this book called Wonderworks, which is sort of 25 discoveries of literature throughout time. It's a really interesting book, but more fascinating, I think, is Angus himself. He is a real contrarian thinker. It's very cliche to say a first principles thinker, although that is certainly what he does as well, taking something that is taught to anybody who goes through an education, the idea of literature or the idea of critically analyzing literature, and he basically just reassesses it and says, well, what's actually the purpose of this? Spoke about many things with Angus in this chat. My favorite part definitely had to be his take on the hero's journey, which is obviously something that I find quite fascinating given my interest in Carl Jung, but also just separately, I've written about the hero's journey before. The idea that there's this monomyth, which is recreated again and again and again for all of our most popular stories and TVs and movies and so forth. But he has a really cool, interesting take on that. But then furthermore, Angus offers a different way of thinking about teaching literature as well, which is just so fascinating. So I really hope you enjoy it. Before I get to him, I just want to quickly say that if we've made it this far on the internet together, if we've made it to this niche somehow, work with me. I am going to assume that we have more in common than we do not. I just published today on my website an explanation on Nietzsche's slave morality, as well as the other day published a post about about the paradox of big algorithms and how there's sort of like BS averaging to the mean rather than promoting our individualism as it might have, as the promise of the internet might have been otherwise. But go on there, I'm writing a lot on there. You'll see the newsletter there as well. But then also excitingly, I've got a geopolitics and power podcast and a risk, randomness and uncertainty podcast, which is focused on Nassim Taleb's work in the Inserto. But it's too much promoting my stuff. Here is the chat with Angus. He's a legend. This was a fucking good chat. And also really excitingly, he's got a comparative mythology book that he's researching that's going to come out in the future as well. And you can be guaranteed that that's going to be covered here. So here's Angus. Hope you enjoy. Cheers. Well, Mr. Fletcher, thank you so much for joining me here this afternoon. Well, my nighttime, your afternoon.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Ryan. I'm super excited to be on the pod.
Cool, man. Like I said, yeah, I'm really amped to have you here. You've just published this new book, Wonderworks. How is it being received so far?
Yeah, well, I mean, to my surprise, it's gotten an enormous amount of attention. And I say to my surprise because I'm kind of part of a rogue group of sort of rebel literary critics who think that the way we're currently teaching literature should be changed and should be innovated. And for about 50 or 60 years, we've kind of existed in a kind of sort of like secret think tank in the middle of nowhere. But it now seems like maybe we're breaking out into the mainstream.
Why do you think that is? Could it be a way that media is being consumed differently these days? There's way less barriers to entry for maybe a less popular view like yours, or at least more contrarian view?
Yeah, I definitely think. One of the great things about the world today is that anyone can get their point of view out there. But I'll also say, I do think a large part of it has to do with the fact that we're living in a world where people are starting to realize that the ways that we've been taught to think about stories and the way we've been taught to think about books and movies, it just doesn't work. And so all of us have had this experience of, we love a novel or we love a movie or we love a poem, and then we talk about it in class. And then, the things we talk about in class have nothing at all to do with what we actually liked about the movie. We'll have these interpretations that we'll do, or talk about like the symbolism or these various arcane things, and none of it actually really connects with our experience. And then more importantly, none of it actually helps us make our own arts. And when you look at the way things work in engineering, if you like an iPhone or you like a rocket ship, you take a class. In that class, you learn how it works, and then you can go off and build your own rocket ship or iPhone. But in literature classes, we do this thing that's almost magical and mystical. And so basically, the point of my work and the point of my research and the point of the stuff we do is to completely demystify literature, to explain to you the technology behind how it works, to empower you so that you can use it. And that partly means so that you can get more of the stuff out of literature that our ancestors got out of it, more of the healing, but also more of the creativity. I mean, one of the great things about literature is it just makes you more imaginative. But also to empower you to create your own literature. So that if you want to make movies, if you want to write novels, if you want to write poetry, the point of the book is just to give you a blueprint, a kind of a first step to be like, it's not mystical, it's not magical, it's no different from anything else that humans have invented.
So that's an interesting place to shoot off from, because ultimately you start off by saying a rogue literary group. I wasn't aware there was one. I mean, I suppose it's kind of cliche. Personally, when I sat in a classroom and was, reading a book as a group, we're all reading the same book, we're all talking about what it actually means and so forth. And I think every student had the same idea, was I didn't actually think it meant that. And then we start questioning the professor, like, does he actually know what it means, or is he just trying to tell us what it means? So I think instinctually, inherently, we kind of realize this. This might be a little bit too much early on, but is it also possible that you're running into the exact same the exact same almost bias, where you're just putting your language onto it as your interpretation of it? Or is it not same, or is that not fair to say, because you have this neuroscience sort of understanding of it underneath?
Yeah, to be clear, it's more than the neuroscience. So no, what we're doing is different. We're not actually interpreting literature. And maybe it would be good to start by explaining what interpreting literature actually is. So when you get into a classroom, what you're told is that a novel is words on a page. And you're told to close read those words, and you're told to analyze those words and determine what they mean. And you come up with an interpretation. And interpretation is another word for an argument. You're saying that the poet is saying this about life, or the movie is saying that about democracy. It's making an argument. We reduce all these works to arguments. And what our group does, what our rogue group does, is we say, actually, literature is not words on a page. It's not that at all. It has nothing to do with words on a page. Forget that. Actually, what literature is an experience in your brain. And the first thing you discover when you experience literature in your brain is it's not words, it's not syntax, it's not logical meanings, it's not representations, it's not arguments, it's not themes, it's not any of this stuff that we learn in school. Instead, it's characters. You read a book and you connect with the characters, and it's plots. There's a story. You connect with the story. And it's a world. You inhabit a world. You enter a world. You enter a new imaginative space. And it's a voice or a narrator. You feel like you're in the company of someone who's telling you a story. These things, and we probably don't have time to do it on this podcast, and your audience probably isn't interested, but you can actually prove that these things do not exist in words, and that it's impossible to extract them from words, from interpretation. And that's because interpretation uses something called symbolic logic, which is the same thing that computers use, and which is different from the way the brain functions. So what we do in our group is we say, actually, just forget all this stuff, because first of all, it's really complicated. Like, you go to school, you learn all this stuff, it makes your head hurt, it's weird. It alienates you from the books that you read and the books that you love. And it's also not helpful. Because what literature evolved to do is the same thing that your brain evolved to do, which is, in the case of why we're interested in characters in literature, well, that's because our brain is interested in people. I mean, the reason you invited me onto this podcast is you're like, hey, Angus might be this interesting guy. And the reason I came on this podcast is I'm like, hey, Ryan might be this interesting guy, right? We didn't come here to have an interpretation of each other or to exchange meanings. It was because we were humans. And so basically, our approach has nothing to do with interpretation, has nothing to do with that stuff, and has everything to do with your own normal, natural, ordinary intuitions.
Mm-hmm. But isn't there a different experience between, say, my interest in you as a person, or my interest even as a character on film? Isn't that different to us literally reading words on a page, a story? Because I don't quite understand why literature isn't words on a page. It can be more than words on a page, but it also is words on a page. Could you like double down on this explanation for me?
Sure.
I don't fully understand.
Sure. Okay, so there's two parts to the explanation. The first thing is that actually, for most of its history, literature has not been words on a page. It was oral literature. And writing only came about 5,000 years ago, and there's good reason to suppose that literature is maybe 100,000, maybe even 1 million years old. Literature may, in terms of oral literature, predate our species, and we can go into that if you're interested. But before we go into that,
by literally, no, sorry. We have maybe a 2-3 second lag, but forgive me. I just want to qualify that point. By literature, if you're saying it goes back 1 million years, we're defining it as any story. This is literature. Beyond just dialogue between hey, can you start the fire? Can you get some food? It's, hey, did you hear about the man who got the fire and then started the food? That is when it becomes literature. So that's what you're saying. That's the very beginning of it.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, first of all, I'm a scientist, so I don't believe in a philosophical definition of literature. I'm not going to define literature. What I'm going to do is I'm going to describe it in the same way that I would describe a biological species. And the way you do that is you go backwards. And so what I would say is our oldest examples of literature are myths and legends. Myths and legends. So anything that's a myth or a legend, that's definitely literature. And you could argue that myths and legends are made up of some interesting things like metaphors and heroes. So that's all literature. And then you start to go forward and you say myths and legends create ancient tragedy and theater. And then theater creates the novel and film and comic books. And so these are all part of this biological genetic tradition of literature. So that's what I mean by literature. I mean it in a biological sense, things that emerged out of this activity that we as humans did in the ancient world, where we told each other myths and legends.
Okay. Let's go on a little bit more to explain sort of where your authority comes from to write this book and to and to make these arguments. So much of the insights from the book are then compounded with the sort of neurological explanation for what is happening and why. You have a really interesting resume, as it were, more or less, where you went from neuroscience to I think it was screenplay writing and an academic, and I'm sure there's other things interspersed in there. Could you just say what is your experience to then qualify you to write these books and make these these very definitive comments?
So first of all, I do want to say at the outset that like all professors, I know nothing, and I wouldn't want anyone in your audience to think that the things I'm saying are accurate because I have a degree or whatnot. I would want them to test them against their own experience. Right. I mean, that's ultimately the basis of what I believe, is it should be testable against your own experience. I'm not a cult leader, and I'm not here to kind of, propound my own authority. Yes, but in terms of, my training and my background, yes, I have a pretty impressive academic background. I started out in neuroscience. I worked for 4 years in a neurophysiology lab. At the time, I was considered, a little bit of a prodigy in neuroscience, and I surprised my mentors by leaving neuroscience to go study literature at Yale. And the reason I did that is not because I was interested in literature for traditional reasons. I was interested in it for the reasons that a neuroscientist is interested in literature. I thought to myself, stories and literature are the most powerful things that humans have ever invented. I mean, that's what I thought as a neuroscientist. And I thought that because literature is a way of changing the way the human brain works. And if you believe, as I believe, that the human brain is the most powerful thing on earth, if you believe that the human brain is responsible for some of the most glorious things that exist on our planet, and also possibly for destroying our planet and wiping it out, then you think, okay, anything that can go in and change the function of the human brain is pretty powerful and pretty important. And literature can change our brain in extraordinary ways. I mean, on a most basic level, it can troubleshoot the brain. It can help us move through grief, through trauma, through anxiety, through loneliness. It can also enhance and improve the brain, both on an emotional level by giving us things like courage and empathy and joy, but also on a more intellectual level, it can make us better problem solvers. And I think most profoundly, it can make us more creative. And creative thinking is the source of innovation, is the source of all scientific breakthroughs, it's the source of all technological breakthroughs, it's the source of all arts. It's the source of all painting, pretty much the source of everything. And all of this stuff is empowered by literature. The human brain can do these things normally, but on literature, it can do them better. And so once you start to realize that that's what literature is, you want to understand how it works and how it does it and how we can get more out of it. And so got my PhD at Yale, was at Stanford, my first job. That's when I made connections with the storytelling industry, Karen Pake at Pixar. And those connections are because, again, I think like a scientist, and I want to work with people who are practically making stories, who are involved in real-life experiments where they're testing and trying new stories, and that was Pixar. And so I learned a lot from my interactions there. I went on, and because of that, I was asked and have been asked and am still asked to do a lot of screenplay consulting and screenwriting. But that's all just kind of for me, as a it's a little bit like if you're an experimental physicist and you get to build a rocket ship or something. That's not necessarily my main job. It's more
You
just
test
like,
your ideas, I guess.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a chance to see if it actually works. And it's also just a chance to learn from practitioners in the field, in the discipline. And, since then I've been recruited to Project Narrative, which is in the middle of Ohio and which is recognized as the world's leading academic institute for the study of stories and how they work. And kind of my special twist is to add the neuroscience to that. So what makes Project Narrative special is it doesn't think that stories are the product of an author. It thinks they're the product of an author plus an audience. And it thinks that feedback loop between author and audience is a kind of scientific experiment where the author tries things, the audience gives feedback, and that kind of back and forth is what generates innovation. And my kind of extra thing is to bring in the neuroscience. We actually run experiments. We're looking for funding to do more experiments. So we don't just say wacky things. We actually say wacky things and then test them with brain scanners and psychology studies. So anyway, that's a kind of brief bio of me and my background and my expertise or not.
Yeah. Cool. Amazing. Thank you. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. First of all, actually, no, I'll ask this other question, otherwise I'll forget it. Of the 25 inventions that you discovered within literature, there is a lot of there's a lot of neuroscience that sort of explains what's happening here. Did you test like all of these inventions? Is this also like in an essence a scientific? Is there scientific research behind this as well? Like you're testing. You're testing the neurological response to a certain invention or not. Is this also happening? Like the scientific method is at play in Ohio?
Yes.
I forget the name of it. Sorry, say it again.
At Project Narrative. Yeah. So, okay. Yeah. So first of all, I don't want to make it seem Project like Narrative. Everything in the book is true, because that would not be science. The way science operates, and I would not want to make it seem that because someone has run an experiment or two experiments that proves that it's true. That's not how science works, What the method is in the book is it says, based on what we know about the human brain and, based on what we see historically in terms of the function of literature, let's start to identify specific blueprints, specific technologies that are associated with psychological benefits. And once we've kind of identified them, let's start to run tests and trials to see if that actually works in practice. And so those tests and trials can take the form of scientific studies, but hopefully readers of the book will also try them themselves in their own experience, because a lot of literary innovation preceded science, obviously, and so a lot of it is something that can involve kind of more subtle mechanisms of detection. But absolutely, everything in the book is built to obey the scientific method. It makes predictions which have to be verified through experiments. And if anything in the book is debunked, we would remove that from the book in the next edition, and we would run more experiments. And so the point of the book is to contribute to this ongoing process of science, and you can think of it in the way that you might think of Charles Darwin's, Origin of Species. He had a lot of data in there, and a lot of it was tested. But some of the things that Darwin said have subsequently been revised or enlarged by subsequent generations of science. And that's what it means to be a scientist, as opposed to being a theologian. I'm not putting out the final word on this. I'm just saying this is what we know now. And importantly, the reason for that is because this knowledge is useful. Not because it's right, but because it's useful. And because the more you use the book and you use the information in the book, the more you can get out of literature. And the more you use the method in the book, the more you can go beyond the book and discover other things.
There's so much that I want to speak about the survivorship bias of successful storylines, more or less, that then get reproduced again and again because the economics deems that they're more reliable, right? And so definitely want to get into that. But first, this question just came to me that I didn't think of before. But if literature is a major source of innovation in the brain, right? If it's more or less, sort of like the peptides of a high functioning person, like these ideas, the way that they're consumed and so forth. Do you see a distinction between literature that's written on a book or viewed in a movie. Just because it's certainly true that there is a huge generational gap between the way literature is consumed, if both are literature, right? And is there a distinction there, right? So is the Lord of the Rings masterpiece from oh God, I forget his name, Jackson, equivalent to Tolkien's written books, for example? Like, just to try and say an equivalent of like excellency on both sides, or is there a distinction between the way it's consumed and then the way that it's going to actually the effects of the literature are actually going to come into us?
So, I mean, the answer is both yes and no. So the ways in which, and I should say, you know, I worked a lot with Bob Shea. He actually bought my first big script, which was actually a biopic of Tolkien. I studied both the
was
books.
that the one that came out a year or two ago?
No. Ours was a different one. Ours was a different one that never got made. So yeah, no. This is the life of screenwriting in Hollywood.
Sorry.
No, it's actually fine. It's probably better that it never got made. But the the way in which they're similar is that they both tap into certain core narrative mechanisms in the brain. So they both tap into certain kind of core mechanisms of story, of character, of world building. And so in that way, there can be a lot of overlap between the two. But they're also obviously different. Visuals have a different effect on our brain than words do. They can produce more wonder. They can produce more awe. They can sometimes be stronger in terms of an emotional effect. So sometimes you can get a stronger emotional effect from a movie than you can from reading a book. A book, however, can be more...
because you're not creating the world yourself... Sorry, the delay's frustrating, but I just want to cut in there. Because you're not creating the world yourself as you would if you were reading it, perhaps there is less of a... innovative creative process going on in the mind. Like it's a little bit more passive if you view it. It's like you're being told that's what it looks like rather than saying, these are his descriptions, this is what he looks like.
So that's definitely true. Absolutely. That there's more work going on because your brain has to kind of translate. Because this is what I was saying before about books not actually being words. Words are a kind of shorthand, which your brain then picks up on and then tries to recreate the intent of the author. They're not literally that information rich, and they actually don't contain most of the information that we need to know in order to actually produce the story. And we have to bring a lot of that to ourselves in terms of hypothesis, conjecture, speculation. We kind of guess a little bit about things, and then that is verified or not verified or whatever by the story. So yes, there's a huge amount more work done on the written page, and that means that when you read literature, it does stimulate more creativity in general. That doesn't mean that's the only way to get it, but it does mean that it does stimulate more creativity. But you oftentimes get less wonder, and, you know, sometimes you can get a lot less therapy from reading. To take the example of ancient Greek tragedy is generally more effective in performance than it is reading it. You get more cathartic effect for various reasons. So anyway, this is a long way of saying that I think all the forms of literature are good and different in the way that all the forms of life are good and different. You know, there's something you get from a monkey that you don't get from a horse. It doesn't mean that a monkey is better than a horse or a horse is better than a monkey. It just means that they're different. And the question is, what do you want to do? And so the point of the book is to teach you, if you want to do this, maybe a movie is better. If you want to do that, maybe a book is better. There is just a kind of series of options, and the more we start thinking what's best, what's right, what's true, we're out of literature and we're into morality and we're into ideology and we're into these things which are actually counterproductive to creativity because they make us think, oh, there must be one true thing as opposed to many possibilities.
I agree just from a instinctual point of view. I don't have any, knowledge to back it up, but that both are good. There isn't one bad and one that's good. And so while that distinction might be true, could you then comment on perhaps, say, a generation, my younger brother, right? Smart guy. He's probably read a book or two in his entire life, but he's watched a lot of movies. He's watched a lot of TV shows. And I think he has like an informed worldview, similarly as if he had written a bunch of books or even, just keep it to stories for now. So can you make a commentary on what maybe less books and more movies might say in a sweeping generational statement, what it might move us towards versus what older people might have been attracted to more so. It's a pretty unfair question. I totally understand. But I don't know. It's just come up. I thought maybe.
No, I mean, it's not an unfair question. It's a completely fascinating question. And I wish I had a very clever and insightful thing to say about it, but I don't. I mean, the first thing that I'll say is that my own bias is that what literature you consume is less important than how you consume it. So, for example, in the case of your brother, is he actively going out and trying to watch things that kind of expand and challenge him? Is he constantly trying to grow his library of things that he's watching? And then is he trying to write or create his own works? Or is he trying to, maybe have conversations with friends about it? Because if you're engaging actively with literature, that's how you get more out of it. The way you get less out of literature is if you're just reading the same genre over and 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 over again, Now that can be emotionally satisfying and that can be very important therapeutically. And that's not, so I don't want to knock that, but you will get less imaginative stimulation out of it. So it's really the question of how active you are, I think, is important. I mean, the other thing about visual storytelling is it can lead to more magical thinking. And what I mean by that is when you see something presented to you in front of your eyes, it can lead you to think this is true. This is actually the way that it is. And that can be very powerful in terms of shaping your sense of what is actually real, because in the deep centers of your brain, if you watch a lot of a certain kind of sci-fi movie, you might think, oh my goodness, that's actually real in some kind of deep center of your brain. And so that can have that kind of effect where your brother might actually be living in a slightly different reality than you. Because in his reality, things seem more accessible or possible than they do in your reality, because in your reality, it seems like those things are harder to achieve or harder to get to. So that's another kind of thing that you might notice, is that sometimes when you talk to people that consume a certain kind of literature, they're very, very convinced that certain things are accurate, which you might not be convinced are.
Yeah. So what strikes me, and I felt the same way when I've listened to in previous interviews, very sort of like first principles thinker. The idea that, words on a page are only like a node to make you think what that word actually is. And then going from neuroscience and thinking, how does literature actually affect the brain? Because our brains are the first step to everything else that's, happening in the world. Anyway, a lot of first principles thinking. But you still went from neuroscience to literature. I imagine you had just a passion, a deep interest in literature beforehand, and you thought maybe this was a way that you could double down your understanding and also at the same time be involved in research for something that you're very passionate about. Because the book, I mean, it's just like the entire Western canon is sort of, surmised in its own little paragraphs here and there. Like the amount of research that would have gone into it, I was just like, Jesus Christ, how much time would he have spent? So how much of it was original research? How much of it was stuff you already had read and reread and you loved?
So I have to be completely honest, which is to say that I knew almost nothing about literature when I entered Yale. And this was the result of, the first 2 years I was there getting my PhD, they were like, what is this weird scientist guy who's wandered in? Because I had not read almost any Shakespeare. I'd read a couple of plays in high school. Okay. And that was completely it. And then other than Shakespeare, I hadn't even heard of 95%
as well.
Right. Yeah. I hadn't heard of almost any of the authors that were being read or talked about or discussed. I didn't know anything. And I honestly felt very kind of, out of my depth and out of my league. And what I spent 2 years doing there was just reading everything. And I read it again the way that a neuroscientist would read. We're very systematic in the way that we think. And, we think about, as I've already talked about, things evolving in a kind of biological sense. And I also thought about things evolving in a kind of tool-based sense. So I thought, well, if the novel came about at a particular period of time, it must have been very useful. And if it kept getting reused, it must have been useful. So I read stuff just very differently. But yes, to your broader question, that kind of set off my fascination and love of literature. And the reason I developed it then was because when I was younger, I hated literature in school because of the way that it was taught. I mean, I hated going into a classroom, having a poem, which seemed a perfectly nice, interesting poem, and then being told by the teacher that it meant something complicated, or that my way of reading it was wrong, or that I had to write a paper about it. I mean, who writes a paper about a poem? It's the weirdest activity. Who came up with that idea? Why would I want to read a poem and then write a paper about it? I mean, if I read a poem, I want to write a poem. If I read a novel, I want to write a novel. I mean, that's how the human brain operates, you know?
And furthermore, a paper that's going to be judged according to how right you were in interpreting it.
That's right. And so I should just say this whole logic of right and wrong is the opposite of creativity. If you start thinking to yourself, what is right and what is wrong, you will never be creative. Because what will happen is you will start to self-censor. You will say, oh, that's not right, I shouldn't do it. And creativity depends on the possibility that a lot of things can be right or just adequate. And you have to let go of judgment to be a creative. And that's one of the reasons why I'm just appalled by the way that literature is now used in schools, primarily to teach critical thinking. Every time I go anywhere, I'm informed that the purpose of literary education is critical thinking. That is bonkers. First of all, no one has ever read a novel and thought, oh, that made me so much more critical. No one has ever read a poem and they've thought that made me more creative, that made me more imaginative. So the idea that you would teach critical thinking out of literature is just completely perverse and goes against every basic intuition we have. Second, why is critical thinking so useful? I just don't understand. I mean, critical thinking to a small degree, I understand there is a place for it in life and it's not without purpose and value. But if all we are is critical thinkers, all we're doing is being negative and judgmental. And almost all the good things in life are the result of creative thinking and positive thinking and having optimism and all these things, which are much harder to learn than being negative. And I feel like our entire society is awash with negativity and criticism and judgment. And why is literature being sucked into this vortex when it should instead be the other way around, and it should be giving us hope and joy and possibility and friendship and empathy and all these other things, which are so much more sustaining of human life?
Well, since we're on literature being taught, what's your ideal classroom look like when literature is discussed? You know, how would you do it differently?
Okay, so let me just start by saying a couple of things that everyone usually thinks are completely crazy. The first thing is that I have for the last 15 years never once told my students to read a piece of literature. I have never once come into the classroom and assigned a text and said, you should read this. Instead, what I do in every single one of my classes is I say to the students, bring in either your favorite work of literature or talk to somebody you like and admire and bring in their favorite work of literature. And then every week we will read that work together and we will use the tools which I will teach you to unlock why that work is so powerful. And so the first part of the way that I would change things around is I would get rid of the canon. And I would get rid of the idea that there's a bunch of books that we're all supposed to read. Because the whole point of literature...
Nice, I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the whole point of literature is, if you're a reader, the most exciting day in your life is to go into a library because you can choose. There's just so many books. I mean, how awful would it be if you went into a library and they were like, in order to read the next book, you must read this book. And then you must read this book. And every time you went to a library, you were assigned a book. I mean, no one would ever go to a library ever. It's completely ridiculous. That's not why readers like libraries. We like them because of the choice.
And then you just get over reading at the age when you should be getting into it most.
Exactly. Yeah, it completely kills the joy and the fun. So the first thing is just get rid of assigning books. Get rid of that idea that there are certain books that we should all read. It's completely fine if you go through your whole life without reading Hamlet. Why would you need to read Hamlet? I mean, if you like Hamlet, great. If you don't like Hamlet, don't read it. I mean, there's no point in reading things you don't like, in the same way that there's no point, in traveling somewhere if you don't want to go there. It'll just be a negative experience. Wait to the moment in your life when you want to go, then go. So the first thing is that. The second thing is, when students come into the class, the way that we read literature is the first thing I say to them is, what did it do to your head? What, using your own kind of built-in brain scanner, what were the emotions you felt, or what was the change you felt in your head, or what excited you, what was going on in your head, what characters did you notice? And so we then start by analyzing the students' kind of primary perceptions, and then we trace those back to moments in the literary work, and then we start to identify the specific inventions or technologies that are producing those effects. And the key there is not to focus on what's universal about literature, but what's specific to each text. One of the things that I think is a real danger of literary analysis is when people try and become universalizing about everything. They'll say, oh, all great stories do this, or all great stories do that, or all great characters do this. I mean, that's totally not the truth. Everyone knows that there's a huge variety out there. And also, just in life, special things and innovations are always unique in some way. They're not regurgitated or reiterated. So if you want to find out why something is your special book, there's something unique about it. There's something distinct about it that's different from all the other books. So when we read it in my class, we're trying to identify what's that unique thing? What's special about it? Why did you pick this book and not the 800 other books you could have picked? And the same way that when I have you as my student, I'm not going to be like, oh, you're just like all my other students. Here's what's universal about you. I'm going to be like, what's distinct or unique about your brain? What are your passions? What are the questions that you want to answer? And it's by leaning into that specificity that's where creativity comes from, that's where innovation comes from, and that's where growth comes from. And so, again, that is the kind of big way that I would just reshape the curriculum on a practical level.
You're very, very energized. I can feel like the passion about the topic as well coming through. I wish I had more passion in my English education. I'm someone who didn't read any books in high school, and until I was in my early 20s, read a book and thought, oh, I actually liked that book, and then picked up a book similar to it, and then all of a sudden, I like reading all of a sudden. Whereas, beforehand, my high school text was, I can't even remember, but it was Frankenstein, Huckleberry Finn, and a few others, and we'd sit there in class and stop every line to have an explanation for what this meant, and it was just like, is this reading? This is boring as fuck. I don't want to, So you're right. Now, you're coming at it from a university perspective, which obviously is a little bit different. Is it true? Do you agree with me that it's like really high school where you want that passion, you want that message that you can read whatever you want. It doesn't have to be interpreted one way. That's where it's most important, and that's where it really needs to be injected most. Like, is it a curriculum from the top down that makes this, a very difficult bridge to cross, or are there bigger constraints in the way of changing the way that we teach literature, or at least teach reading?
So I just think that the way that you read literature in high school is almost the way that everyone reads it in college as well. I mean, I think that method is pervasive everywhere. And I think it all needs to be junked. I mean, that's my personal feeling. My personal feeling is we need to go back to middle school, go back to kindergarten. I mean, just completely
blow it up and start it again. Yeah,
blow it up and start again. Yeah. I mean, the focus should be on joy. The focus should be on emotional growth, and the focus should be on creativity. I mean, that is what literature is about. It's about, first of all, just having fun. Everyone reads books because it's fun, and that shouldn't be bad. Just because it's in school doesn't mean it can't be fun. Things can be fun. I mean, I challenge you to find anyone who's good at their job who isn't having fun at it. I mean, almost all the stuff we do in the world that works is fun. So the first thing is it should be fun. The next thing is it should connect to your emotions and to the realization that as a human being, your emotional growth, your emotional well-being, your happiness, your ability to process grief and anxiety and move through those things is really important. And that's a huge foundation of who you are as a person. And we shouldn't just neglect that in school because we're so obsessed with mathematics and these other things. We should focus on the whole person. And then finally, it should realize that the highest result of human activity is creativity. Creativity is the most remarkable thing and the most important thing that humans do. It's much more important than critical thinking. Creativity is what allows us to solve problems, to change the world, to inspire each other, to get up in the morning. And so, we should be emphasizing that. And what has happened, at least in America, is we have this terrible thing called the Common Core. And the Common Core sees literature, and it teaches literature from kindergarten through 12th grade as a source of critical thinking and argumentation and logical inference. In other words, it takes literature and turns it into essentially what is a mathematics exercise. And why would you do that? I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all. It's a completely inefficient way to teach math, and it ruins literature. So you should either, if you're going to do that, just get rid of the literature and just teach math, or teach literature for what it is. So I do think we have to go back to the beginning, rethink the way we're going to do it, recognize that we as humans need to have fun, need to be emotionally complete, need to be creative. And then once we've kind of changed it in high school, change it in colleges. Get rid of essentially what happens in most college classes is you're taught that the purpose of literature is to make an argument about something. And so you go in and you read a book, and then you're like, now I'm going to have an argument. Why? Isn't the world full of arguments? Why do we need more arguments? What is the point of arguments? And the whole concept that arguments are somehow useful, in my view, comes about from a misunderstanding of liberal democracy and how it works. But regardless, even if you think that arguments are important, there are already plenty of arguments in the world. And nobody's listening to any of them or cares about them. And what we really need in the world is not more arguments. We need more empathy. We need more listening. We need more problem solving. Again, we need more creativity. I mean, these things are what we need. And that's what you get from literature, not argument. So anyway, that's my basic belief on how it needs to change. And then again, that's the reason for the book. The book is basically, here's the college education I wish you could have. And I wish this was just the first class. And I wish that after reading this book, there were all these other books and all these other classes you could take, because that's the opportunity that's out there.
Nice. And hopefully also a really cool second, third, fourth order effect of putting this sort of new information, or at least synthesized information, out into the world as we start to see much more different stories come around, a little bit away from the predictable summer box office story, which I get a lot of guilty pleasure out of. I don't want to be like snobbish and saying they're not any good or anything like that, because this is not the case. But there is some movies that I remember enjoying a lot more, and they had just had, they had an originality to them that wasn't predictable, that wasn't so sort of like, that wasn't a dichotomy of figures. It was always good and bad, happy, sad, like there was nuance. But nonetheless, let's get back to the book for a second, because I want to ask you if there is one particular effect on the brain that comes through literature that you're most energized by, you think is most fascinating. I have one that I want to talk about, but I just wanted to give the opportunity to see if there is one that you really, really like more.
No, I have to be honest. I mean, the reason I wrote the book is because I just think there's so much. And so it's a little bit like asking someone who's in an ice cream factory, which is their favorite flavor of ice cream. I mean, the answer is it's all the ice cream. So I don't have a favorite one. I mean, cool. I do think on a basic level, there are certain things that are more important than others, and those are early on in the book. So I think that love is very important. And I think that empathy and courage are very important. And those are early inventions. And so those are early on in the book. But then as you go through the book, you get kind of more and more and more stuff that kind of helps you grow more and more and more. And so that's the idea, is basically it's all about where you are in your life and the problems that are confronting you. And again, it's the library. It's not like there's one book on the shelf that you just have to read. There's a whole library out there, and all you need is a good librarian to help you find the book that's right for you now.
All right, that's really interesting. Let's give the audience a taste then, because the book is 25 chapters. Each is a discovery, your discovery of an invention that's come through literature, which is then backed up by neuroscience. Let's talk about the empathy chapter. Could you give us the skinny on that, just as a taste of what it looks like? And for the audience, I mean, there's 24 to go after that, which is, very exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, what each of the chapters does is it identifies a psychological benefit in literature, and then it traces it back to a specific invention that happened that you can find, that's simple, that you can identify. So in the case of the empathy chapter, empathy is this just remarkable, wonderful thing, which is the basis for most human societies actually being able to function, because it's our ability to let go of our anger at someone, see something from another perspective, and move on from it. And the reason that empathy is so important is because our human brain has evolved to blame everything that happens on another human. And you just see this, anytime something bad happens, you immediately look to find out who is responsible for this. Why is it that my coffee is cold in the morning? Why is it my taxes have gone up? Why is it that I can't find any bananas in the supermarket? Somebody must be to blame. Somebody is incompetent. Somebody must be found. Somebody must be punished. And then if we can't find an actual human around, we then usually are like, oh, why is it raining? We imagine humans in the sky who are gods, who are angry at us, who are making it rain or whatever. So the human brain has just evolved to think that everything must have a human cause and everything must be blamed on a human. And what this means is that we're just all angry all the time about stuff that we just don't need to be angry about, because the reality is that most of the stuff that goes on in our life is nobody's fault. It's just nobody's fault. First of all, it's amazing that the world works at all. I mean, just think how extraordinary it is that in a very short period of time, I mean, we're really talking maybe 3, 4, 5,000 years, human beings have just built this most extraordinary advanced culture where we're just sending messages to each other through space, you know what I mean? And eating food from all over the world.
But,
I mean, it's amazing. So anyway,
yeah.
Did you want to jump in?
But yeah, I just want to say that the point is very that's something that does catch me off guard sometimes. Like, holy fuck, how amazing is it that society actually works? But then you know the saying, like, there's a very thin veneer of society, and how quickly it could all come tumbling down. And it's built on sort of social contracts, and it's built on a not subliminal, but a non-said agreement that we will treat each other relatively well, and that does come from some sort of empathy, but then also some sort of self-preservation motivation as well. But that, I just wanted to emphasize that point. That is very very true. Like, how amazing is it that it actually works and we can cooperate at this ridiculous scale to create all the things that we have around us? It's remarkable. It's crazy.
Yeah, and we should get up every morning. We should be grateful for it. I mean, we should be like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. I mean, and so anyway, this is just a long way of saying that it's not just actually amazing, but if we want to keep it amazing, we actually have to have more empathy and less anger. Because when we have anger, when we start to blame things on other people who we don't see or who we imagine, must somehow have let us down, then that has two really negative social effects. The first is simply that in our own brain, it makes us stressed, it makes us less happy, it makes us more irritable, it makes us more likely to kind of have friction with the people around us. And the second thing is it kind of creates this culture of we must get together and punish the people who have done this to us. And then what almost invariably happens is some politician shows up and is like, I'll tell you who's responsible for this. It's that group over there. And we've got to burn them. We've got to burn the witches, or we've got to set fire to the immigrants, or we've got to take care. And it just immediately just turns into this ludicrous thing where we're all getting angry at someone for whom it isn't their fault. We're going to punish them. It's not going to make anything better. And we're just sort of descending into cruelty and mob violence. So empathy is one of the main reasons that society can exist, can function. Empathy exists in the human brain without literature. It's one of the reasons that we are, as I said, able to kind of function these ways, but literature can dramatically enhance it. And so I talk about that in the chapter. And so I talk about it in a kind of two-step way in terms of figuring out what the inventions are that allow us to have more empathy. So the first is an invention which doesn't come to us from literature at all. It's the apology. The apology is something we don't know exactly when it was invented, but the apology is this remarkable thing that humans made up. It doesn't exist in nature. It's something that we contrived. Yeah. And when you apologize to someone, it releases them from anger. If you say, I'm sorry, that's an opportunity for that person. And we know that it actually stimulates these perspective-taking networks in the other person's brain, and it makes them sort of briefly enter your perspective, and it makes them think, oh, I understand. They weren't trying to do it. It wasn't intentional. It wasn't to harm me. Maybe they won't do it again. So an apology is just this extraordinarily powerful thing. Now, there's, however, a limit to the apology. And the limit to the apology is we never know for sure whether or not it is sincere. We never know whether someone, when they're apologizing, is telling us the truth. And the way that the human brain kind of works this is if the human brain is certain that the other person isn't telling the truth, then it will kind of discount the apology. And we've all had that experience in our life. We're like, oh, that's just crocodile tears. But then there's this huge gray area where we're not actually sure about what's going on. And the human brain generally in those moments sort of inclines, but not always, to empathy. Well, what happens with literature is for the first time, we're able to see characters make an apology and know that that apology is true. And the reason that we're able to know that it's true is because we're given direct access to their thoughts. And the inclusion of the apology in literature, as I talk about in the chapter, starts actually in the book of Job, when Job apologizes to God. But then it gets more sophisticated. You start getting in theater, for example, in Shakespeare, you get characters such as Richard III. And through essentially their monologues, they reveal their psychology, and they say, when no one else is watching, just to themselves, I regret this. And when they say that, we feel empathy for them. We can even feel empathy for a terrible human being like Richard III. And then the novel comes along. And in the novel, we can start to dip into characters' thoughts without them even talking. We can actually hear their unspoken thoughts. And we can start to feel empathy for them. And that's why the novel is such a powerful source of empathy. Almost any time you read a novel nowadays, you get access to a character's thoughts. And then that character expresses regret, remorse, feelings of vulnerability, of imperfection. And that direct access allows us to practice empathy. And so this technology is a way of allowing us to kind of practice getting over our anger and practice imagining the world from other people's perspective and practice letting go. So that's just a very simple example of something that literature has done, but it's a very important thing because empathy really is the basis of society, or at least the kind of society we have now. There's justice, which is a kind of very foundational thing. And then on top of justice comes empathy. And without empathy, you wouldn't have the societies we have now.
Yeah, and I suppose the empathy can also go further than just the apology as well. When you see a character and you understand his motivations, but you see that no one else understands his motivations except for you, the person watching, and it might look like they're doing everything wrong, but believe me, he's got the right intentions. He's going to be fine. Like, that's where you're learning the empathy, which you can then apply to your own life, and if you consume enough literature with enough really good lessons of empathy, I suppose maybe it strengthens your empathy bone. I'm not sure. Could you get into the neuroscience of it?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a famous and interesting and actually contested area of neuroscience because we're actually running a study now, I should say, in my lab to kind of identify and kind of and sort of mark this stuff. But historically speaking, people have known that people who are more empathetic tend to consume more novels, but no one's been able to actually pinpoint. So Keith Oatley, who's a psychologist at the University of Toronto, has done a lot of these studies, and he has shown pretty clearly that there is this connection between people who read more novels and people who experience more empathy. But the question has always been,
and so is your hypothesis that they've learned empathy through their consumption of literature?
So that's what we think. There's also the possibility, of course, that it's because they're more empathetic that they read more literature. But the study that we're running now at Ohio State is meant to sort of knock out that possibility. And, we'll see. But there's no question that whether or not literature automatically makes you more empathetic, it can train you to be more empathetic. Which is to say, once you actively engage with it and recognize, and again, that's the point of the book. The point of the book is to say, whether or not you naturally become more empathetic by reading these books, once you know what the technology is doing, you can then use it actively and you can get more out of it. In the same way that when you read Winnie the Pooh, it doesn't necessarily make you more creative automatically, but once you understand how it's working on your brain, you can then lean into the technology. And so the example I would use here is something like a bicycle. It's possible to sit on a bicycle and just coast down a hill and not get any exercise out of it. But once you understand how the bicycle is meant to work, once you understand that, oh, these are the pedals and I turn the pedals, then you can become better at the bicycle. And it's the same thing that we're trying to do here is we're trying to say, yes, you can just kind of blindly fumble around and accidentally use literature. But once you know how to use it, you can then strengthen actively the parts of your brain.
So I'm just looking at the time. I really want to speak to you about the hero's journey, but I just want to bookmark some topics which perhaps we can get to after if we have the time. But sort of speaking about irony, the greatest invention of literature, then comedy, and then a little bit about left brain, right brain stuff as well. But just to make sure that we do the hero's journey justice, I want to sort of introduce it now. And I know, forgive me, it's not explicitly a part of Wonderworks, but nonetheless, it is something that you've written about before. You assert that Carl Jung's archetypes are more or less bogus, right? And so we want to get to why that is. But can you explain? Is your take that the hero's journey is just explained through sort of survivorship bias? That it happened to be that all of these original myths that we had across the world had more or less similar storylines, and these are the archetypes, more or less similar characters. And because these were the first stories, we just kept building on top of the old, and therefore we get to the point now where The Lion King and Star Wars and Chef and all these movies have this supposed hero's journey within them, and we go, okay, well, wow, this must be inherent, this must be instinctual, these must be stories that just we were born with, not the fact that they're just the stories that we keep hearing again and again. So that's my take on what you see it as. Could you just riff on that for a little while?
So to a certain extent, I do believe in survivorship bias to a certain extent, and we can talk about that. But I'm actually saying something a little more fundamental than that, which is I don't actually think most of the stories that we think are heroes' journeys are actually heroes' journeys. And as a simple example of that, first of all, what Joseph Campbell is saying by a hero's journey is quite specific and precise. It has a number of stages in it, all of which sort of, have to be obeyed to kind of maximize the effect of the hero's journey. And if you actually look through almost any literature, they're just not there. With the exception of a few of them, for example, which exist in Star Wars, because George Lucas had actually read Joseph Campbell and was attempting to insert them into Star Wars.
Yeah.
But if you remove those elements from Star Wars, it wouldn't have the effect of making Star Wars less magical. There are other elements you could put in which would work just as well. So the first thing I just want to say is that I just think that we have kind of gotten into this zone where we think, well, anytime a hero goes on a journey, it must be a hero's journey. And then we think, well, okay, what is a hero going on a journey? It's anytime anyone goes anywhere or has an adventure. Therefore, everything that involves someone having an adventure is a hero's journey. And that is totally bonkers. That is just the definition of a plot, for one thing. Okay, go for it.
Yeah, just let me interject 1 second. So what if we take what you've just said there as the truth? And I think it's plainly obvious. Not all the classic hero's journeys do the 12 stages. Let's say, even if I take out 3 or 4 of those stages and I say have 8 stages or 7 stages, that it's still a hero's journey. All right. Does your argument still hold water? For example, just because he did 11 out of 12 stages, not a hero's journey. What if we give them a little bit of flexibility? Can it still then be a hero's journey? And perhaps there are some like fundamental things like refusing the call to adventure, going into the dark cave of the unknown, almost perishing to win the prize, like the stakes, all these sort of things. If they're still included, can it be a hero's journey still?
Well, I should say to a certain extent, I'm not a great person to ask because I don't believe in the hero's journey, and I'm not trying to define the hero's journey. But what I would say is sure, if you want to kind of have a stripped down, the way that this works is people then start to strip down the hero's journey and say, well, actually, really, it's simpler and narrower. And then usually what I most often hear people say is, well, really what a hero's journey is it's someone who has the courage to enter a different life and then bring back the knowledge of that life to his earlier life. So in some way, it involves a kind of metaphorical death and rebirth or something like that. You know what I mean? And that's really what the hero's journey is. And all these other kind of things are great and everything. But, Joseph Campbell, he just got kind of focused on these details and he kind of missed the big picture and the rest of it. So, what I would say is, well, if that's your definition of a hero's journey, what that means is essentially is that anytime a character changes, you have a hero's journey. Basically, a character changes because anytime a character changes, they've undergone some confrontation with something which is different from them, which has forced them to change. And then on some level, they've communicated that change to us, if for no other reason than we're watching it. So even if they haven't literally come back to the earlier place that they left from, even if they don't literally do a kind of, Luke Skywalker and like return back to the home planet, they have nevertheless communicated that information to us by virtue of the fact we've watched it. So what I would say is, well, if your definition of a hero's journey is a character undergoes a change, then I would say yes, that is a very kind of pervasive form of literature. What I would say, however, is ironically, that form of literature does almost not exist at all in the ancient stories that Joseph Campbell talks about. Those stories are not
Okay,
stories about
interesting.
characters who undergo a change, because the ancient idea of character is that characters don't change. And so, to the extent that anything happens with those characters, and I think this is Campbell's reading, is actually they don't change, but they go somewhere and they acquire truth and they bring the truth back, or something like that. So they don't change, but somehow they get truth and they bring the truth back, and so on and so forth. Um, that is a very uninteresting story. And that's why nobody reads those. Nobody wants to read a story about a character who doesn't change and who brings back the truth.
Hmm.
That's because we as humans
Hmm.
are much more interested in character growth, character development, and also because we're very skeptical of truths that are presented to us
We
through
can't
literature.
empathize with a character like that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And in fact, almost
Mm.
nobody nowadays actually reads any ancient myths or legends. What we mean by myths and legends when we talk
Mm.
about them are things like Tolkien, which in fact involve many, many modern uses of storytelling. I mean, very famously, I think the beginning of The
Yeah.
Lord of the Rings is very funny. And so is The Hobbit. I mean, there's a lot of humor in there. There's a lot of narrative interjection, in terms of the narrator. These are not things you get in ancient myths and ancient legends. There's a lot of world building. There's all this kind of stuff.
Hmm.
So I mean, the thing about talking about the hero's journey is it's a little bit like when you get into a conversation with someone about like the spaghetti monster or something, and you say, "I don't believe in a flying spaghetti monster that exists in the 28th dimension," and then people start saying, "Well, what if you define the flying spaghetti monster as this? How do you really know? And have you been to the 28th dimension?" And to me, it's kind of a ludicrous conversation to try and disprove something. It's more my main objection with the hero's journey is it completely wrong foots us on what the purpose of literature is.
Okay.
If you take the hero's journey seriously, regardless of what the structure is, let's just forget about that for the time being. What Campbell is saying is that there is a truth, and Jung is saying this too. There's a truth, a spiritual truth, which inheres in the universe and which inheres in our brain, and we have access and connection to this truth through story. And so ultimately, the purpose of reading story is to discover this cosmic truth, which connects us eternally to everything. That is not the way the human brain works. The human brain is a product of evolution by natural selection. It is not implanted with archetypes. The way that it operates is by being adaptive. And narrative, which is the source of stories, is its mode of adaptation. So, what narrative does is it allows us to come up with new plans and new plots. A story to our brain is a plan or a plot. And a plan or a plot is a way of coping with a threat or an opportunity. So, if I arrive and I see something about to attack me, I say, this is a threat. I need to come up with a plan or a plot to survive. And I do that. If I arrive and I see a huge field full of food, I think I've got to figure out some way to get all this food back to my house, and I come up with a plan or a plot to do it. And so the point is that narrative is a flexible tool for allowing us to adapt to unforeseen threats and opportunities. It is not an archetype for communicating transcendental knowledge. The only way that would make any sense at all is if the universe had been created by a god who found it necessary to implant this story in our brains as a kind of like odd way of communicating with us rather than directly explaining to us what it is that we're supposed to do. And if you hold to that
Mm.
view of life, if you believe that there is a God who created things, I don't want to challenge that. I simply want to point out that the science
Hmm.
does not support that. The science supports the other direction.
Mm. I mean, in terms of the the archetypes and Carl Jung, there is an inherent religiosity to it. The idea that they exist in our collective unconscious, and it's not a Christian God or whatever, but there is a spirituality to it, something which I suppose an explanation for falls outside of the realm of neuroscience or any rational scientific explanation. But if we just look at the hero's journey still, I remember there was this book called The Writer's Journey. John Favreau and Tim Ferriss were talking about it, and it is the hero's journey adapted for screenwriters. And he followed it to write his movie Chef, which is a great movie. And he himself goes on this hero's journey. The stakes are much lower, obviously, but nonetheless, he goes on this journey. Is there more? Is it kind of a problem that your gripe with the hero's journey comes from the fact that it's almost become within Hollywood, I guess, or within script writing guilds, basically people are convinced that this is the structure, this is the recipe we need to use to convincingly sell a movie, because look, it's worked so many times before. This is what people want to see, you know? So change the names, change the scenes, but we want this plot line to happen again and again and again. So I guess the question becomes, is it them just saying this is reliable and we're going to meet the demand with this supply? Or is it something instinctually, a story that comes from our earliest myths, like, you know, Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung are trying to make us believe, the fact that we inherently feel these stories so deep within, and that's why we connect with them on this whole another level, and that storyline is way more exciting than any other storyline? Or is it just the fact that it's like, again, I'm saying it again, but it's the best word to describe it, the survivorship bias of this particular type of movie?
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, if there was something intrinsic about it, Hollywood would have a much easier time. Chef would have made $8 billion, you know, because we would have seen it and we would have been transformed, you know, and we would have had this kind of just amazing experience. I think that, first of all, yes, Hollywood is a very scary place, and it's filled with a lot of scared people. And it's a lot easier to do something when you feel like it's tested and proven. The same thing happens all the time in business. People don't like to make decisions unless it's backed by AI, but a lot of that AI is just bogus. I mean, we know it's totally bogus, but it gives you, you can say, oh, look, there's this spreadsheet full of data. I'm going to make this decision. Therefore, it must work. And so a lot of times people are just looking for a kind of confidence
Or
boost.
if you're
or
a
confidence
.com
lift.
company in 2001. Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so I just want to say, yes, I mean, and there's nothing wrong with a story that uses that blueprint. I mean, there's nothing at all wrong with that story. I don't want to imply like somehow it's a terrible blueprint or anything. In the same way that it's not terrible to have, you know, a horse-drawn cart. It works. A horse-drawn cart works. The problem is that if you have an industry that keeps insisting that everything be a horse-drawn cart, you know, and it all has to be a horse-drawn cart, all has to, you know, then you just limit innovation. And you limit growth, you limit change, and you limit writers' creativity. So, you know, there's no problem whatsoever with people deciding that they want to do that. That's fine. But when you have an entire industry that is anxious about anything else, and that immediately starts to respond with these, well, where's the precipitating incident, and where's, you know, the refusal of the call, and the, you know, where's the this and where's the that, you know, it just leads to just very repetitive formulaic stories. And the one thing we know about humans is humans are not interested in formula. I mean, this is the other main problem with archetypes, is I have yet to find a human being who's actually interested in archetypes. I mean, it's very boring. Human beings are interested in wonder. Human beings are interested in new experiences, all these kinds of things. And to the extent that a hero's journey can help you enter a new world, and can provide that kind of wonder, audiences will tolerate it because they'll say, okay, well, this is just a kind of boring way for getting into something interesting, and I'm okay with that. But don't confuse that with the hero's journey somehow being itself interesting. It's not. Hero's journeys only work when everything around them is really wonderful, and I think that's what Star Wars is. I mean, if you had travel back in, I mean, Star Wars even today is still pretty amazing, but if you could just go back in time to when, you know, Lucas actually released that, and you're like, what is going on? Look at these creatures, look at this world, look at the, I mean, that's what's amazing about Star Wars. It has nothing to do with the hero's journey and everything to do with the world. And I just feel like this obsession we have with the hero's journey causes us to miss the true essence of George Lucas's genius, and it causes us to just get caught. So anyway, so that's my thing, is I'm not here to say the hero's journey can't work or never works. You know, I'm just, the idea of an archetype makes us think that things are eternal when they're not, so it discourages innovation, and it also causes us to miss what's really important about screenwriting and George Lucas, which is creativity, imagination. Everything that's remarkable about Star Wars is weird. I mean, it's really weird. I mean, Wookiees are weird. I mean, lightsabers.
It's amazing. Yeah. What I'm actually thinking now is that perhaps the reason why we read about the heroes of a thousand faces, or we hear about the monomyth, or we hear about an archetype, is it's quite romantic for us to imagine that there is this like instinctual story within us, and it almost explains us as human beings and how we're different to the other animals because we have these. And perhaps it's just we over romanticize that a little bit too much, and it's also become quite big in pop culture. I'm not sure if you're familiar with, you know, a man called Ray Dalio. I mean, he attributes like a lot of his worldview to understanding how the hero's journey works and how him making his some of his financial investments are along the lines of one small hero's journey, and it is making me think about it differently for sure. Just so you're aware, my audience is largely people who are really interested in Carl Jung, just because of one of the guests I had early on, a man called James Dowling. He's going to come on again soon. And we're going to talk specifically about the hero's journey. And he's a guy who, depth psychologist, really deep on the Freud, Adler, Jung side of things, and so has a bit more of a the think about the archetypes from a collective conscious standpoint and so forth. But nonetheless, I just want to say that as like a I don't know, contextual for where I'm coming at this and why it is so interesting to me, and why also your like contrarian view to it is also so interesting, because I guess we sort of just do take it for granted. It's like, oh, so you're telling me all my favorite movies had the same storyline? Well, shit, I guess that must be instinctual to me, I mean, maybe that's, but then again, as we've explained, that might not actually be the case.
Well, and look, here's the thing. I'm not here. I mean, it would be rude for me to walk into someone's church and be like, your God does not exist, and I don't want to do that. Like, I mean, I think human beings, we're tiny little things clinging to the surface of this planet, which is flying through space at incredible speed and ultimately going nowhere. And as for part of our own psychic wholeness, we need to come up with stories and narratives that give us a sense of meaning and purpose. And I'm not here to tear down or annihilate anything that gives someone meaning or wholeness or is helpful to them in their lives. I'm simply here to say that there is more beyond that, and that you can believe in the hero's journey as much as you want, but don't let that stop you from exploring new things. Don't let that stop you from being open to fresh stories. And don't let think that there's somehow a boundary or limit to where your journey can go. Because there is just way more in life. And when you have a biological as opposed to a Freudian view of life. So, I mean, the thing about Freudian psychology and whatnot, I mean, we don't need to go too deep into this, but I mean, Freudian psychology is obsessed with pathologies and what's wrong with us and fixing us and all these kinds of things. And, I come from positive psychology and, which is Martin Seligman, University of Pennsylvania. And that's just focused on something different. It's just focused on, actually, there's a lot less wrong with us than we think. It's actually pretty remarkable that we're as functional as we are. We're these apes that evolved accidentally and have done extraordinary things. And we should spend a lot more of our time congratulating each other, being kind to each other, being grateful to our ancestors, thanking people, as opposed to like worrying over the fact that something is broken in our head or we need to be fixed, or that that there's some kind of psychoanalyst that we have to go to fix us. I mean, to me, just as a word of advice to anyone who is considering any kind of therapy, the indication that therapy is effective is it makes you less reliant on your therapist. That's what effective therapy is. If you enter into a therapeutic relationship
100%.
where all of a sudden you think more and more about your therapist and become more and more dependent on your therapist and all those kinds of things, it's not working. The point of therapy is to emancipate you. And the reason we got rid of Freudian therapy is because it was just creating terrible dependencies. That's not to say that everyone who does Freudian therapy is bad therapists, but it is to say that in general, there are other alternatives, and the purpose of life is emancipation, freedom, joy, possibility, more, as opposed to, everything fits into this one box.
Amazing. Really speaking my language there. I just wanted to say one thing that you were talking about. We're just clinging to the earth, flying through space. We're going to be here for a short amount of time, an absolute drop in the ocean compared to the amount of time that we're going to be here. And it just made me think of Gandalf to Frodo. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. And I just wanted to put that in there. It just came to me as you said it. So just to round off archetypes, hero's journey, Jung, Joseph Campbell, can you explain some of the neuroscience behind why you think Jung's archetypes are bogus?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, there's just no evidence of them. And there has never been any evidence of them. And, what Carl Jung is evidence of is human creativity, human ingenuity. I mean, the ability for someone to make up an incredibly compelling story and convince a lot of people that it's true. But there's never been a shred of scientific evidence. I mean, the whole idea of the monomyth and whatnot comes to us, from really the late 19th century and, comparative mythologists like Frazer, who basically went around the world. Or actually, Frazer didn't actually go around the world. He actually sat in his study and sent letters to people around the world. But basically, they went around and tried to prove that all these myths were actually versions of Christianity. And their reason for doing that was simply to prove that somehow there was one right way of doing things, which was the British Empire, and that everyone was going to catch up. And then this justified the British Empire compelling everyone to adopt British culture. So it was just a deeply, and that's why he was knighted by the king and the rest of it. It's just a deeply imperial way of going about things. First of all, there's no evidence for it. Second of all, it just goes against biology. What biology tells us is that human brains are diverse and adaptive, and that we thrive on this planet because of our ability to be mentally flexible, not because of our ability to hew to things. Now, it's absolutely true that we need a sense of emotional purpose and emotional support, and the idea of something bigger than ourselves can give us that. And that's why things like archetypes and religions and gods are often very, very attractive to people, even though there's, of course, no evidence for any of them. Is because we as human beings need that, because we have narrative brains. And as a narrative brain, we want to know, where is it going and where did it come from? We have storytelling minds. And so we ask these questions we want answers to them, But it's much more effective and kinder to the people around you not to try and impose master narratives. And the reason for that is that master narratives tend to make us happier at the expense of other people. So if I say, I know that this is true, that gives me a lot of comfort and peace and support, but it makes me less flexible. It makes me less likely to listen to other people. So it has all these kind of negative effects. And that's why religions in general promote in-group happiness and have negative effects on other people's happiness. And so if you want to be kind to others and kind of go along this collective journey that we're all going on, the best thing to do is basically be open-minded and be like, other cultures have different stories. Actually, when I go to India and I say, hey, you guys are all telling heroes' journeys, that's actually not true. Like, I'm not listening to Indian culture. I'm just like, not listening to Indian myth and Indian. I'm not realizing it's actually quite different. When I go to Mesoamerica and I say, hey, the Aztecs were all telling heroes' journeys, that's actually not listening to what's different and unique about their stories. When I go to China, same thing. When I go to Africa, what we should do is we should open our minds to the fact that these cultures are different. They're telling different stories. And actually, what is common about humanity is not the fact that we have a universal story, but that we have creativity and originality. And that makes us all different. And that difference is both a source of joy and excitement, because it means we can walk into other cultures and have our minds blown by something which is not like us. I mean, it's very egocentric to go around the world and be like, oh, this matters because it reminds me of myself. I mean, those are like the worst kind of travelers, aren't they? People that are like, oh, this food, it just reminds me of the food I have at my local pub. I mean, like, what is wrong with you, man? No, this food is different. Like, taste the difference, or someone who goes to Fiji and is like, oh, this just reminds me of my own backyard. What are you talking about? Look at the fauna, look at the flora. It's actually different. So this whole habit, to me, it's imperial, both in the sense that it, actually injures other people, but it also injures yourself, because it just makes you close-minded and not appreciate the fact that what's wonderful about the world is its variety. And what's exciting about other human minds is the fact that they can surprise us with their own originality. And so that, to me, is why I just think that whole way of thinking is ultimately the less spiritual and less sustaining way to go. And if you listen to anyone, this is my experience anyway, anyone who's an intelligent Freudian or an intelligent Jungian, what happens is they get further and further and further away, and they start saying, well, there's actually more archetypes, and they're more flexible, and they're, and then, and it's like the hero's journey. I mean, people who are flexible and and eventually they sort of get out of the whole theory to begin with, and so why have it? It's just like a kind of weird piece of baggage that you're carrying around, because, even though you've grown beyond it. So that's my thought on the process: is liberate your mind, open your mind, embrace diversity, embrace the world, and just take this opportunity to grow and be more than you're born.
Yep. Amazing. Angus, you really, I don't think you realize how many notes you're touching on things that I am always preaching previously as well. But two things came to mind then. And I want to ask the first one first so I don't forget it. Do you suspect that there are inventions in literature that we haven't discovered in the English language that exist in other languages across the world that we're just sort of waiting to, I don't know, either discover or in a translation they're lost?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. No, I mean, so one of the things about this book is, I touch very, very briefly on African literature and Chinese literature and Indian literature and stuff. I mean, I touch very briefly, but 95% of the book really is literature that comes to us from the Mediterranean and Europe and North America. And so think about all the stuff that I don't know. And think about the stuff that, none of us in our Western universities know. Absolutely. There are extraordinary inventions waiting out there to be discovered in other cultures, and also in the future of other cultures. Other cultures are going to discover, maybe there's a writer right now and she's being born somewhere in a country that we're not even thinking about. And 20 years from now, she's going to revolutionize what literature is. She's going to transform what we think that it is. And that's why we have to do, I think, a better job of being kinder and more empowering to people in other parts of the world, because their difference is valuable. Their difference is inventions always come from people who think a little bit differently. And that means people who don't think like us. And, the challenge of life is we always go around and assume, oh, that person thinks like me, they must be good. But actually, no. You want to get out of that bias, and you want to be like, that person thinks differently from me, therefore I need to empower her, And in the West, just speaking as someone who lives in America, we do a terrible job of that. We're always cutting off funding to people who don't do what we want them to do. We're always trying to control people. And controlling people, that is just awful. You just never want to be controlling people, because then you're stopping them from growing into who they are. So absolutely, other cultures have stuff that's waiting for us to be discovered. They're going to create things that we can't even imagine. And in the history and in the archives of literature all over the world, there are inventions which we haven't forgot or don't understand. And that is what's exciting. It's sort of like being Indiana Jones. I mean, you can just go on an archaeology expedition and just find all this stuff that every day something new blows your mind. And
the ultimate adventures.
Yes, even better, right? Even better than the hero's journey. It's the ultimate adventure into the library. So absolutely, yes. There's so much stuff waiting out there in other cultures.
I hadn't read this beforehand, but while speaking about the archetypes and the hero's journey, there's the idea of comparative mythology and going back to the first stories that we were told as individual cultures. And on the theme of creativity and originality, it is just a whole nother worldly. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to get into it too much, but the Aboriginal creation myth of Australia, there is nothing like it anywhere else in the world. The Norse creation myth. I'm probably going to make a podcast soon, like discussing the Norse mythology. There's nothing else like it. It's so original. It's so creative. It's amazing. I just wonder, is this something that you also have paid a lot of attention to over the years? Maybe trying to go back to the first stories and trying to be like, wow, where did this all come from? And, why is this unbelievable creativity of the Egyptian mythology? Like, why isn't it being, I don't know, what's happening? Why are these crazy characters that we just can't even imagine anymore? Why are they not being created so much?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So my next book is actually on creativity, and this is actually the research that I'm doing now. And absolutely, you see that in these earlier traditions. And I think the main reason for that is people were, in a certain sense, freer. First of all, if you were actually a creative person in that culture, you were relatively unique. Now we have an entire huge class of creatives, and all of them are kind of being monitored and judged and kind of ranked on stuff. But in those cultures, there was, you were the poet at court, or you were, whatever, and you had an enormous amount of autonomy just to do anything. And the guy in charge was like, okay, I guess that's what we believe then. We apparently believe that there's a giant snake which circles the world and it's eating its tail because that's what our bard just said. Let's go with that. So I think there was just a huge amount, and that's where creativity thrives, in that sense of anything can go. As long as it touches the emotions or kind of touches the narrative circuits of the brain, that huge space. Yeah. And I think that, one of the things we should do when we go back to these ancient creation myths is celebrate them as instances of creation. They are making something, and when you make something, it is inherently original. That is the point of it, not the point that it is universal. The idea that you create something universal goes completely against the idea of creation. Universality is a feature of logic. It's what computers aspire to. As humans, we aspire to do things that are different, that are distinct, that are idiosyncratic, that are odd, and that's what gives them their power. In terms of the brain, the reason for this is that what makes our brain special is it's a processor of something known as exceptional information. exceptional information. That means information that is not normal. Our brain notices things that stick out. Things that stick out are potential opportunities or threats. And the creative engine of our brain is fed by that sense of the weird, the unusual, the aberrant. That's what generates all the stuff that our brain does and is good at. And so I think that one of the best things to do when you read these old stories is just to be like, oh my goodness, and not look for an explanation, not do this awful thing that people do when they're like, oh, the reason for this, in the case of sort of, like Dreamtime or kind of, ancient kind of, Australian myths, people say, oh, well, the reason for this is actually because this mountain formation occurred at this time, and that's why they're talking about mountains. I mean, that is the most ludicrous way to approach a story, as if somehow a story has existed for 10,000 years because it identified the location of a mountain. When a mountain, there are much simpler, more efficient ways to do that. It survived because it inspired creativity and wonder and joy and all these special, spectacular things, not because it communicated information or had a meaning or a theme or an allegory or something like that. So yes, absolutely. Go back to the ancients, go back to the creation myths, and explore the true originality, the true weird that is human imagination.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a really exciting book, and I'm kind of envious that you're, getting paid to do this sort of research, get to look at the different creation myths and figure out, what's going on here. Where does this creativity and originality come from? Just to give people a taste of how weird the Norse mythology creation myth is, you've got the fire and the ice that meet each other, and then from the meeting there is the watery salt that comes, and the fucking, it's a cow of some sort, is licking the salt from the ice, and then it licks out the first giant. And this giant, his son is Odin and a bunch of others. They kill the giant, and then with that giant's body, it becomes the earth that they live on. And they explain the mountains are his teeth, the water is his blood. And it's just like, it's ridiculously weird, obviously, superbly creative, and it's like a way that people are trying to understand the words around them, and it comes through literature. Angus, you've been very generous with your time. I see that I've run it all up now. Can I get 5 more minutes from you just to do some closing questions? Okay. Of all the literature published in the last 20 years, which do you think will still be read or watched 1,000 years from now?
That's a great question. And I don't have the slightest idea. I mean, I can only tell you that my own favorite works of literature are works that are weird. So I love Terrence Malick. I don't know if anyone's a Terrence Malick fan. I actually love Alexis Wright's novel, Carpentaria, which is a kind of sublimely, surreally strange piece of writing. So, I mean, my guess is what I would say is if something is really weird, something that's really quite not generic. I mean, the kind of thing you pick up and you're like, I can't even believe that this got published. That was so odd. Those are the works that are most likely to be around, because Shakespeare was the weirdest writer of his day. He was not the greatest writer of his day. He was the weirdest writer of his day. So I would say look for something that you just can't even believe is out there. That's the most likely candidate.
Yeah. That's also your bias, though, isn't it? Because you really romanticize people that are taking this risk and doing something different and weird.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well,
but you don't have nothing comes to mind? Like last 20 years, something that's that good, that's unanimous?
No, because we just don't know. I mean, we really don't. I mean, this is the kind of amazing thing about it. And first of all, you are absolutely right. I'm completely biased and should not be trusted on anything. I mean, this is the thing about professors, is we just have our own points of view that we inflict on other people. But I think genuinely, I mean, nobody thought Van Gogh was very good. It took years for people to think that that Einstein wasn't an idiot. I mean, Einstein for years, people were like, that is total, and it might turn out that he's still wrong. We're still not sure about it, but generally true genius is not recognizable within a 20-year period. So I would not pretend to be able to identify anything that is true genius. It'll be someone weird.
I actually do agree with that. It would. I mean, 1,000 years is a long time. Even something like Harry Potter might not survive that length of time. The meaning of those stories might sort of fade away, and it could just be some like weird Franz Kafka who writes after he gets home from work, who hasn't published shit until he dies. That ends up being the stuff that survives. It could be something crazy like that. Okay. Final question for you, Angus. If you could witness a conversation between any two people of history, dead or alive, who would they be?
Oh, this is such a totally fascinating question. And I'm not even sure I have a good answer for you, but I suppose probably my favorite thinkers are Machiavelli. So I'm just totally fascinated by Machiavelli because he's
Okay.
such a
Cool.
peculiar, smart kind of
Yeah.
counterintuitive thinker. Um,
He had
and
a
yeah,
whole
I mean,
weird
I get
sex thing going on, didn't he?
Machiavelli. Well, he did sort of leave
Didn't
his
he?
wife, well, I mean, he's mostly famous for being tortured and then being condemned to a little farmhouse where he wrote sort of like letters in an attempt to get back into the graces of the Medici family. But yeah, I mean,
Uh,
I think there has been some work recently that indicated that maybe that there was some kind of things going on at the because he would retire
yeah, I
every
just saw that
day and then
recently. Yeah.
go across. Yeah, it does. Yes, um, so yeah, so I mean, so probably yeah, probably what I'd love to see is I'd like to see a conversation between Machiavelli and Shakespeare because to me those are the two kind of biggest
Okay.
innovators in the history of the modern. I mean, Machiavelli's the guy who comes up with the idea that innovation is a good thing, and Shakespeare's the guy who innovates
Mhm.
literature, which is kind of my favorite thing. So I'd love to see the two of them actually meet. They might just actually dislike each other intensely, or it might be a good conversation. I don't know.
Amazing. I love it. It's usually that's a staple I give everyone, and it's usually two religious figures. And I like that it's not. I think that's a great
Oh
answer, a
yeah,
fascinating answer.
you can't get less religious than Machiavelli.
Angus, wow, thank you so much. I'm sorry that we didn't speak explicitly too much about the book because believe me, I did have a whole list of questions prepared, but I think that's just such the way it is. But nonetheless, the book Wonderworks, I had a terrific time reading it. One of the coolest things in it, for me at least, is these weird, well, not weird, but fun anecdotes of the authors or of situations that the authors might have been in at the time. I mean, the amount of research that went into it comes through the pages because it is, the anecdotes are relevant and they add flavor and they add character. And I really like that. For me, that was my favorite thing about it. But nonetheless, fascinating book. Thank you so much for giving me this time now. And I wish you the best of luck with the book and keen to see the next one too.
Thank you so much, Ryan. It's been a pleasure to come on, and if I ever get that creativity book written, I'll be sure to send it your way.